exhibited in a way that makes historical and aesthetic sense. Before that exhibition happened, people wondered how on earth it would be possible and after it had happened. Everybody was just so grateful it had happened. We learned a lot. It produced 2 books, and I think Michael's working on more publications on that material as well. Michael also works on, well, a very broad range of stuff indeed, metal work and wall paintings as well. And in fact, it's on wall paintings that he's going to speak to us this evening. A couple of years ago now, I think, you published a book on wall paintings at St Albans, and it's a very useful book indeed. And it's an accessible book in terms of the cost, and the images are wonderful, and it includes the late medieval material too. But the name of the lecture tonight, the title of Michael's lecture tonight is From Defacement to Revivification, a digital-archaeological approach to illuminating the nave paintings of St Albans Cathedral. Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Julian, for that very gracious introduction. I have a little introduction myself in that this paper was written before lockdown and was partly in memory of Sharon Cather, and I was invited to talk by David Park at a conference that was to be held in York, commemorating Sharon, who died. And so in a sense, it's a tribute both to Dave and also to Sharon. Dave had been a great supporter and encourager of my research from a distance for a long time. I should also say that much of what I've done is in collaboration with Craig Williams, who is an archaeological artist who works at the British Museum and elsewhere, and I haven't been able to contact Craig since lockdown. None of his phone numbers work. Anyone knows Craig, I'd be very pleased to know that he's well. But this is a paper that is very much a collaborative project in a sense, and it goes back to November of 2015, when Barry Knight, formerly head of Conservation Science and Research at the British Museum and now chair of the St Albans Fabric and Advisory Committee, made a proposal to illuminate the defaced saints that were still visible in outline in the south faces of the 4 nave piers of the cathedral, depicting St Christopher, St Thomas Becket, and what appears to be St Citha, and a group of St Alban and St Amphibolus. You can see there's not much left in many ways. However, they're still discernible. The proposal was first heard by a committee as part of the Alban Britain's First Saint project and subsequently endorsed by the then Dean Geoffrey Johns and the St Albans Cathedral chapter. It was to be a project partially funded through a major Heritage Lottery Fund application, promoting the interpretation of the fabric and the history of the Abbey and now Cathedral of St Albans. After a check was made on the light levels that would be safe to project, the proposal went forward to the Cathedral's Fabric Commission of England and was approved in January 2016. It was then discussed by the Cathedral's own Fabric Advisory Committee in July 2017, and later in November 2017, where questions on light exposure were again raised, and it was suggested that only one of the paintings be illuminated at a time and only during the 2 guided tours that took place on most days. Since this decision was made, so-called peripatetic guides may now show interested visitors the paintings on occasion. Subsequently, it became a sub-project of the interpretation plan, Albans' first Saint project, and which was run by Mather and Co., interpretation consultants, who set up contracts with third-party suppliers for digitization of images and the sourcing and installation of the projectors. I say all that because it is quite a lot of preamble, many years of preamble before we get to any stage of doing anything. The initial enthusiasm for the project was inspired by the impressive and innovative projects of illuminating the west front of Amiens Cathedral and illumination of the wall paintings at Saint Clement de Taoul a World Heritage Site in the Val de Bois, carried out by Bourthon Comenge Motion Graphics and Graphic Design Studio, and their more recent work on the wall paintings of the Sala Capitular at Sigena, partially destroyed during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. In the United Kingdom, the project, sorry? Oh, sorry. Yeah. You don't need to have that view, do you? Let's have a look. Present a view of. There we go. Sorry about that. I imagined it would be automatically the other way around. So where was I? In the United Kingdom, the projection of colours based on the reverse of one of Henry VIII's tapestries at Hampton Court Palace. I'll just stop for a second to say I'm not going to show you much more of these because it's available online and you can see most of these and how they emerge. I'm more concerned about the ones we've got. Also, there's much more colour available on these images. So the didactic possibilities of projecting only selected areas at a time were also utilised at Hampton Court. So this is the front, and then they projected the image of the colours as they are preserved on the back of the tapestry onto the front, so you get an indication of what they would be like. And then they actually then made little stories up by highlighting areas of colour. The problems at St Albans, however, were much more difficult than those posed by either the tapestries, the bas-reliefs, or the Catalan paintings. The surviving evidence was of a different nature in each case, that means each case in different buildings. St Albans paintings were not painted in true fresco, and this was a difficulty because at Towel you did have the underdrawing and then you could project colour, whereas we don't really have that. They survive at St Albans a single defaced surface painted directly onto a thin lime wash covering, typical of English medieval wall painting. Both underdrawing and colour have survived. I should actually mention also that this idea of finding the colour was, in a sense, easier even at the Ashurbanipal exhibition, which also utilised this system, because they took paint samples from various areas, and there you could actually colour those areas onto the bas-reliefs. Whereas, and they could also then project mythical colours, the white, to tell a story at that exhibition, which is all very exciting. In fact, the very first time that's been done at the British Museum. But it's not so easy at St Albans. Both underdrawing and colour had survived the colour climate, enabling drawing the colours to be projected much more accurately and easily than at St Albans. After discussions in meetings of the St Albans Fabric Advisory Committee in November 2017, it was suggested that the professional archaeological artist be employed to investigate the paintings with the aid of an art historian who could interpret the style and dress of the figures. And that was my role, essentially, to help Craig try and visualize these images. It is at this point that Craig was tasked with producing drawings from which digital images could be made to project onto the surviving paintings themselves. It was not possible to fund the resources to carry out the type of detailed digital survey of the paintings that had been achieved at Saint Clement de Taoul. Instead, observations of the paintings themselves were made in situ in different lighting conditions, and use was made of the reasonably high resolution photography that had already been carried out by Angelo Hornack for the book, which I subsequently wrote about the paintings. This new survey enabled us to actually think more about these paintings in different lights. Further photography was also carried out at different times of day, and other photographs were taken in raking light to reveal the surface undulations and markings on the paintings. The number of I should just say, the number of wall paintings that have survived at St Albans is considerable. Apart from the archaeological evidence for painting in the Anglo-Saxon abbey, substantial surviving wall paintings range from about 1190 to the 17th century. Attempts at reconstruction and restoration also date from the 19th and 20th centuries, which in many cases have been to the detriment of the original paintings. Most of the wall paintings were discovered in the 18th and 19th century under layers of whitewash, which were applied at first after the dissolution of the monasteries and no doubt later as part of the maintenance of the interior fabric. As a rule, the earlier the discovery, the more likely the severe damage and loss of evidence has occurred. The worst losses have been in the tomb of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester, 1390 to 1447, his dates there. Antiquarians had reported that a painting of the crucifixion had survived in the chapel in 1703, and it was engraved by Jacob Schneeberle after a drawing by James Bassier Sr. in Richard Gough's Sepulchral Monuments of 1796. Because of Humphrey's notoriety, Georgian tourists marked their visit with graffiti and robbed the body of most of its skeleton so that only one or two bones and a skull remain. The humidity caused, this is important, the humidity caused by the volume of visitors in such a confined space soon caused the paint to peel so that what remains is a beautifully drawn outline. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of art, which unfortunately only survives as the outline, all the colour is gone. The great nave paintings, which are the subject of this talk, I call them the great nave paintings because they are very large indeed, over 3 meters in height, were found under layers of fading whitewash, which was scraped off soon after the discovery in 1862 by the rector Henry J.B. Nicholson. It's reported that he then covered them in a layer of what he described as varnish. By 1902, William Page was tasked with stabilizing the so-called varnish. Page himself applied what he describes in his paper published in Archaeologia for the Society of Antiquaries in 1902 as a specially prepared size, warm, brackets, added to the flakes of varnish by dabbing them, remarking that it was rather a trial of patience. Early chronolithographs of watercolour by Professor Ernest W. Tristram were published by Page, which may be compared with the paintings today. Later still, Tristram conserved many of the paintings at St Albans by applying another layer of wax in order to fix, as he thought, and preserve the colours. It is now thought that although this can be successful in some cases, it has the general effect of sealing the surface of a wall painting and causes it to flake, as well as discolour over time by not allowing the paint surface to breathe. By 1955, even Robert Baker and Anthony Percival, the most respected conservators of their time, carried out work to remove Tristram's wax. Further work has since been carried out on some of the wall paintings by Perry Lithgow Partnership and the Courtauld Institute Conservation of Wall Paintings Department since 1992. The paintings themselves measure about 3.75 meters by 1.22 meters. That's an average of the area covered. And were probably painted and overpainted several times. The identification of at least 3 of them is relatively easy, as attributes and partial inscriptions confirm their identity. From west to east, they depict St. Christopher, who is accompanied by a donor figure who is identified as Domine Richard, and by that probably Lord Richard refers to Richard of Wallingford, 1292 to 1336, the maker of the great St Albans clock. St Thomas Becket is the next one, and St Sitha was identified by the inscription above, which was even in Tristram's day less legible than it had been, and the narrative group of St Alban and Amphibolus. The latter painting is much earlier than the 3 paintings the other three paintings, and it will be argued here that it was at one stage overpainted by another figure, as was the figure of St Cytha. All four paintings may relate to different periods of repainting as well as adjustment before they were covered up and after the dissolution of the monasteries in the early 16th century. The most obvious feature of the great nave paintings is that they appear to have been defaced, whereas other paintings in the abbey appear to have been merely whitewashed before any defacement could occur. It's not possible to determine at what point in the history of English iconoclasm the defacement occurred, but it would be safe to assume that it was after the proclamation of the 16th of November 1538, which encouraged the removal of all images of St Thomas Becket, but on the orders of Henry VIII through Thomas Cromwell. The edict applied particularly to public images, but also to manuscript books. It is notable that the suffrages of St Thomas were quite systematically erased and his name removed from all calendars and service books of private devotion that remained in England. It would be hard to believe that the image of St Thomas would have been allowed to survive the edict in such a prominent abbey. That all four images were defaced in a similar way suggests that it would the scale and presence in the nave that was the cause of this destruction. The nave had become a site of burial for the townsfolk in St Albans, whose maintenance of the wall paintings is evidenced through inscriptions that still survive to this day and other texts, and the removal of the defacements of the paintings may have been a priority because of this. The evidence for the defacement is not, however, straightforward. Areas of cross-hatching areas of cross-hatching around the heads of the first three images from the west is consistent with the removal of heads and the inscriptions that surrounded them. It is possible that the cross-hatching could have been made to prepare the ground for the faces to be painted, but no such evidence can be found in other paintings at St Albans, nor, to my knowledge, is it found in other English wall paintings on limewash grounds. The fact that the erasures also include part but not all of the inscriptions identifying the saints also suggests that this was a deliberate act of defacement. Even if the paintings had survived the Edict of 1538, they are unlikely to have survived the brutal attack on images during the reign of Edward VI. That all the paintings show the same type of cross-hatching suggests that they were defaced at the same time. If the idea that the cross-hatching suggests keying in for plaster has any credence, which has been suggested to me, it would be if the faces were repainted, perhaps during, I don't know, maybe the reign of Queen Mary, but this is a rather implausible way of thinking. It's also clear that at least two of the paintings, so let's just look here at these areas that we've got. I don't know if the pointer comes there. This is the area here. And what you can see here is actually Alban and Amphibolus, but the cross-hatching is not on their faces. The scraping there is accidental across the face, and the faces are not defaced. In fact, the area up here is defaced, and that is consistent with the others, where the area above is defaced, and for some reason the area a little bit further down, I'm not quite sure why. This is the image that the St Alban Amphibolus is based upon. It's also clear that at least two of the paintings, St Cytha and St Alban and Amphibolus, were painted over earlier with images earlier images larger than those that can now be seen. The St Christopher and Thomas Becket, whose images, although apparently not overpainted as such, may also have been repaired after initial campaigns of decoration. The dating for these campaigns is difficult to ascertain from stylistic analysis, but it would seem that the Alban and Amphibolus was painted a little bit earlier, before the collapse of the south nave aisle in 1323, probably early in the third quarter of the 13th century. The composition of the Alban Amphibolus scene bears many similarities with that illustrated by Matthew Paris in his Life of St Alban. In Matthew's version, Amphibolus hands over his distinctive annular cross and exchanges his cloak with Alban. The cross was a relic which had only just been acquired by St Albans through Abbot William Trumpington by 1214 to 35, who believed it had survived through being hidden for a long time in London, noting, as it is stated in the history of St Alban and Amphibolus, it was smeared with the blood of St Alban when he was beheaded and was the first to be brought into Britain. The shrine of St Alban rested for a time adjacent to the nave pier on which the painting survives, and it seems clear that it was painted before the collapse of the south nave aisle in 1323 because of this. But it seems to have either been damaged in the collapse or ceased to have a function in the nave after the shrine was moved to the east of the cathedral in the 14th century. The St Christopher and St Thomas Becket were probably painted in the late 13th and early 14th century, and the St Cyther image was probably painted in the early 14th. She was probably overpainted at the same time as the images of St Alban and Amphibolus. The evidence for this is presented by the faces of the two saints, which were not defaced. I've already mentioned that. The identical marks of cross-hatching indicating defacement are found on the wall surface of St Alban and Amphibolus, but at a level above their heads similar to those of the first three nave paintings. I've already pointed that out. This suggests that the 19th century scraping of the paintings removed layers above the earlier paintings. This is further confirmed by the conflicting arrangement of background decoration found behind the St Cyther image, which suggests two different systems of background decoration, which are now both visible at the same time. And you can see that system there with the dot and these flowers coming out, and then the cinquefoils, which are of a different period altogether. In addition to this, the plinth on which St Alban and Amphibolus stand appears to have been faked up. By faked up is a term we use when there is original paint there, but someone's messed it around to fool you, and they have tried very hard in this case. Close examination of the Alban Grove's plinth indicates that it has been created by paint being scraped off in the 19th century in order to make a match with the St Cyther's plinth. It is also noticeable that the first two canopy arches above St Christopher and Thomas also appear to follow the same model, but St Cyther's appears to have been painted subsequent to initial campaign in order to give a unified effect to the images, but that might be earlier on. But this is quite clear. And in fact, when you get close to these areas around here, then there are clearly other things happening which have been scraped away during the 19th century. You can't see that in my images there, unfortunately. And these are the canopies. The first two canopies seem to be unified in that they have these corbels coming out, whereas the next one doesn't. It's trying to be like it, but it's not quite the same, and suggests the first two may have been painted before the third. The idea of illuminating these battered and defaced images thus pose a number of problems. The layers of painting from different periods of history could only be guessed at through a purely visual analysis. The remit that was eventually worked out put a priority on bringing the paintings back to life, that is, revivifying them so that they could function when occasionally illuminated in a way that made them understandable. And this is really at the heart of what we were trying to do at St Albans, is make these paintings relevant to people who are actually using the cathedral or visiting the cathedral. The intervention, although temporary and non-intrusive, would serve the function of making the paintings in some way more usable in the context of modern functioning cathedral church. The analogy that can be made here is with Pauline Plummer's restoration of the Dispensary table at Norwich Cathedral. Believe it or not, this is what she was faced with, this early black and white photograph of the Norwich retable. Most people don't quite realize this when they visit Norwich, where the head of Christ and the frame have been recreated very sensitively, so that the panel now displayed, that's it in colour, and that's what you actually see, and that's what Pauline did. She recreated and actually painted herself the head of Christ, which is as good as any of the heads below, so it's very difficult to tell. so that the new panel is now displayed on the altar and functions as an altarpiece in Norwich Cathedral. In short, the project is designed at St Albans to help us to understand the paintings as living as well as historical embellishments to the cathedral, but not necessarily as archaeological simulacra of the originals. And I think this is a difference between this project and Taul, which purports to an archaeological simulacra. This is not an archaeological simulacra that we're being presented. A sequence of projected images was therefore created to display the layers of intervention, whether destructive or creative, that can be discerned through enhanced photography. In this way, each layer can be overlaid one over the other, thus treating the surface of the piers as a virtual archaeological site, as well as recreating a rich visual experience. So if we take the Alban amphibulus, you see the areas of cross-hatching, possibly for defacement at the top. High-resolution photography had already been commissioned, as I said, from Angelo for the publication of the guide, but further detailed photographs used raise-king light in order to map the surface. And it was important because when you make the drawing, if the surface, and I have to do this visually, undulates like this, and you do a drawing of the photograph, when you actually project, you have to take into account the measurements for the undulation in the drawing, otherwise it won't match. New measurements were taken by Craig Williams, which were later adjusted to compensate for the undulating surface of the wall in order to marry the projected image with the drawings that had been made. The process of drawing a map of each layer of visible intervention seen on the surface of the wall was then started. This allowed for an understanding of the visible surface based on a segregated and then reintegrated document of what might be called the archaeology of the wall surface. Starting with the gouges and scratches on the surface, which represented the most recent activity on the wall surface, each successive layer revealed itself during the process, going back to what was presumed to be the original lime wash and paint surface. These are drawings of what could be seen actually surviving as drawing on the surface. The places where the lime wash ground had been destroyed and where deep incisions had been made were logged, particularly cross-hatched areas which coincided with paint loss, where the head of the figure could have been visible. It was noted that there were also lighter, shallow scratches which might indicate evidence of 19th century scraping to reveal the images. The deeper cross-hatched scratches occurred on all four paintings in roughly the same area where the faces of the figures should have been. As noted earlier, the faces of St Alban and Amphibulus were not defaced, but the same deep cross-hatching was still observed at the same height as the first three standing figures. It would appear that a later painting may have covered up the group, which was lost during the initial scraping of the workwash that had covered the figures before it was removed in the 19th century. Traces of any surviving pigments were then mapped, which you can see in the third image, and each of the few surviving colours recorded in a separate drawing, which could be overlaid when digitally projected. The separating out of the lacunae, deep and shallow scratches and pigment layers enabled an assessment to be made of the surviving evidence that would not be possible from a visual inspection of the paintings themselves. Ambiguous areas of damage that were on the face of it inexplicable were also noted in case it might be possible to identify areas where the attributes of a saint may have been deliberately excised. In the case of Alban and Amphibulus, it confirmed the presence of a cloak and possibly a cross at the centre of the composition, for some reason had been almost entirely removed. In the case of the St Thomas Becket, cross-hatching of the type associated with the defacement of the head also appears to have occurred over the pallium at the centre of the figure. Whether this is to do with a second painting that was on top of it, we don't know. Where the original paint surface displayed paintwork, such as on the facial features that survive for St Alban Amphibulus, the outlines were redrawn on a separate sheet so that the digital layer could also be created for the drawing. And and that's the second one that you see. This was combined with any legible text elements, and in this case, we chose to actually try and enhance a text element belonging to a 14th century painting below, just for the sake of trying it out, as it were. This final stage allowed all elements to be brought back together for a final assessment to be made. Having been brought together, all the layers were compared with the high-resolution images of the paintings which had already been taken. Comparisons between these images were made with surviving 13th to 15th century images from a range of media, from stained glass, manuscript illumination, panel painting, wall painting, etc., if there is an etc. The discussion then led to the creation of a final drawing. These discussions, which involved many hours of research and comparison, also required numerous drawings to be made, which were nearly all discarded before the end of the process. A final drawing had to be agreed upon. At this stage, evidence from the dress of each figure had to be put into the context of contemporary evidence from other works of art. So that's what we came up with, and I'll come back to this image later because it is a projected image. There is a temporary solution, and I'll mention that later. With the St. Thomas, he is identified by both the fragmentary inscription, S for Sanctus and AS for Thomas, are still visible, and his attire, dressed as a figure he is dressed as a figure of Thomas Becket, which is relatively easy to identify because he's wearing the full regalia of an Archbishop of Canterbury. He wears an alb with the bottom of a dalmatic still visible above his feet. His arms carry the weight of a chasuble of the bell-shaped variety, which was still in use in the 13th and early 14th centuries. He carries an archbishop's cross staff and wears episcopal gloves and a pallium with his maniple draped over his left arm. Surviving images of Thomas, such as that at Hawkston in Cambridge, I just wanted to show you the maniple because, very importantly for me, being interested in Opus Antiquanum, it actually has its fringes, which is quite rare to see. Usually you're confronted with this, you think that's what it looks like. Actually, this is one that survived from the Hollar vestments in Iceland, and we actually have the tassels there, which is a very rare survival. This is Hawkston Church in Cambridge, which is easily accessible if you get out at Royston and find your way there. Yes, where was I? Surviving images of St. Thomas, such as that at Hawkston, also helped to enable the head, mitre and pallium, which are mostly erased, to be reconstructed. The small crosses which would have decorated the pallium and the orphrey on the hem of the saint's alb now appear as darkened areas, but these could be reproduced accurately. Less easy was the reconstruction of the mitre, as this could be depicted with or without lappets. Although two straight lines which appear to indicate lappets are visible, it was decided not to incorporate them, as the scale of the head in the drawing could not be reconciled with their position in the painting. Other aspects, which it may be that it was repainted with another image of St. Thomas, we don't know, and those two bits relate to a secondary layer that is gone. Other aspects of the painting that posed problems of reconstruction included the pedestal and the possibility that a donor figure, once placed at the bottom right-hand side of the figure, existed. This is the area down here, that little area there. I think there was a little donor there, but I can't really prove that. The pedestal was seen to resemble a jeweled box in the 19th century, but evidence for this was sparse. In the end, a compromise based entirely on visible evidence was decided on. Iconographically, the St. Thomas would appear to be unusual, perhaps unique, in that he is standing on what appears to be a jeweled box rather than a plinth. As no other image with this feature appears to have survived to compare with this feature, this may mean that the plinth refers to a specific relic box associated with St. Thomas at St. Albans, which has not come down to us. In the end, we went for the simple solution of this here. because it was clearer and easier to see against the feet. And you can also see we made up the colours because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see the contrast. So these colours are completely not authentic and probably would probably surprise people in the Middle Ages, but they're there deliberately to show the delineation between the two areas, and that was the best solution we came up with. Although heavily damaged, the St Christopher figure was reconstructed through comparison with a large number of surviving images on the walls of English parish churches and in illuminated manuscripts. The indications from the surviving drapery were that the painting could be related more easily with some of the earlier images of St Christopher found in the Westminster Psalter and on the south transept wall at Westminster Abbey, which can be associated with the reign of Henry III, a time when images of St Christopher were first introduced into England. I put these up because they have the inscription, and the inscription did once exist down the side here, but it's been lost. These are more familiar to you, I'm sure, those of you who know the English 13th century, very famous images. And sorry, this slide actually belongs to a completely different lecture, so please ignore all the bits around the side. But it is actually slightly more like these earlier images than it is the later ones. And when you see a later one with the sway of the figure, you see that it doesn't conform to that Gothicizing trend. Although, of course, this could be the remnants of a later repainting over an earlier thing. I think it probably was one of the earlier paintings in the sequence. A scroll, whose lettering is now visible, illegible, is also visible on the right-hand side of the image. It would no doubt have have held a form of the popular invocation, "Whoever shall see this image will not die a bad death on this day," which lies at the heart of the idea that St. Christopher is a protector of travellers. It's probably the only reason, actually. Stylistic comparisons suggest a freer form of drapery was used, which did not depend on the more angular broad folds of the 14th century. Particular importance in this case was survival of the tripartite nimbus of Christ, which proved a focal point around which the figure of Christ could be reconstructed, and the staff of St. Christopher, which had all but disappeared. Both were easily reinstated. More difficult to reconstruct were the folds at the centre of the figure, which gave it its dynamism and character, and the shape of the scroll on the right-hand side of the figure, which may have curved in either direction. You can see I didn't like that scroll, so this was the next attempt by Craig at a scroll which was far too baroque, and then we ended up with just a little bit of curl at the bottom, but I wanted a bit of curl at the top. So it's a compromise in the end. The controversial figure of a female saint, which has been identified as St. Zita of Lucca, known as St. Sitha or Sith in England, posed some of the most difficult problems of interpretation and identification. The badly damaged inscription had been read and misread several times as St. Osytha or Osyth by 19th century antiquarians, who often mistook St. Osyth for St. Sitha because of her more widely understood English cult. Local guides at St. Albans had been wishing her to become Christina of Markyate because of the fame of the local recluse, her psalter and her association with Hertfordshire and St. Albans, but no credible evidence for this identification has yet averred. In fact, the only monument at St. Albans which has any connection with Christina of Markyate is a repainted inscription honouring Roger, the hermit deacon of Markyate, and Segar, another recluse who lived at Northall. Christina did not, of course, live. Christina did, of course, did, of course, live for 4 years in what amounted to a cupboard more than a cell near to Roger, but is not recalled in the inscription, which is also recorded in the early 15th century by John Admonsham, who's probably an amanuensis for Bishop Wheathampstead. There was no altar at of St. Osyth at St. Albans, and no cult of Christina to my knowledge, but there was an altar of St. Sitha close to the north transept. the key identifying features of the image of St. Citha were her prayer beads, which are we would call a rosary, but if you start calling things rosaries, you get into trouble because of all sorts of chronological anachronisms about when the word rosary was invented. So we are calling them prayer beads, and it's quite interesting, the introduction of prayer beads. That's a whole story, and she has a belt and keys quite often. Also, somewhat anachronistically, she often carries a book. She was one of the most important saints for women and servants in England in the Middle Ages. Her cult appears to have arrived via Bury St Edmunds in the late 13th century and soon spread all over the country. By the middle of the 15th century, her life was celebrated in a Middle English translation. Sorry, where am I going? There we go. From the Latin vita. This is an image with the prayer beads, which I'm not allowed to call a rosary. And this is actually a Middle English text which survives the University of Nottingham. She is represented as a saint to whom maids and women in charge of households could pray. And the fact that she is actually a saint of the 13th century, rather like St. Francis, but a female, is very important. And evidence of her ubiquitous beads was clear, but her other attributes of the belt and purse and keys were barely visible, but perhaps discernible under raking light. The watercolour published by Page in 1902 indicated that she may have been a full frontal pose with both arms uplifted, in something similar to an oran's pose. One arm uplifted either side of the body, but this was not confirmed by modern photography, although a layer of paint loss on the right-hand side of the figure is still discernible. And there are images of Citha, and you can see she always seems to have the beads, I'll call them beads, on that side. And this is the watercolour of 1902, and you can see just a little bit of colour on the left, which is now gone. And that needs to be taken into consideration. But when you look at the modern photography, it doesn't look as if there's anything there, and it's very confusing. So we're in two minds about this, actually. A group of lines on the left of the figure can still be seen which may have indicated an arm holding perhaps a tablet or a book. In order to understand how the figure was standing, a number of versions of how the hands related to the gesture of supplication with her beads in her hands was made. The unusual iconography of this gesture also posed iconographical problems. Such gestures of holding up what we would call a rosary can be found in illuminated manuscripts, but they are normally confined to a supplicant or donor figure, as you can see with the two examples I'm showing you there. Given the number of images that survive where she is shown with a rosary and a book, it may indicate that the figure resembled that of St. Faith at Westminster Abbey. And you can see St. Faith carries the gridiron, and the book comes back towards her chest, and I suspect this is what we need to see. We also need to note the plinth. This is an unusual plinth, even at in St. Faith's, with this volute below, and there is a similarity between the two. But there is no similarity in the fact that St. Citha currently does not appear to sit in the middle of the plinth, which, it may mean nothing at all, but it does strike me that the plinth is slightly out of scale with the figure. But I don't know if that is significant in any way. What I would say, though, is that that is the watercolour, and the watercolour probably suggests that this is the image currently projected of the beads being presented in some way, which is, I'm afraid, incorrect. But remember, this is only a digital projection that can be altered tomorrow, should we choose. We were under great time constraint when Craig made that drawing. You'll forgive my drawing, which is the proposed image, not of the same quality as Craig's artwork, where I suggest that, in fact, she was a frontal figure, very, very like the St. Faith. I think that's a more credible image of what we're missing. So the current projected image is therefore, I'll go back to that actually, the current projected image is therefore, in all probability, an erroneous interpretation of the pose. Working in projected light, however, rather than imposing a solution on the wall painting itself, means that an alternative image can be superimposed at a later stage, which would be more in keeping with this alternative interpretation of the pose. It could also be that you could have two interpretations of the pose projected. You don't have to have one. The confusions concerning the figure are almost certainly caused by the fact that it was overpainted by another figure. Evidence of this became clear when the final drawing was prepared because of the bizarre effect of the background decoration. This was not caused by missing elements in the design, but by the fact that two separate periods of design were simultaneously displayed. The figure posed almost unsurmountable problems of stylistic interpretation, so that her dress, although still based on what evidence could be gleaned from the analysis of the surface of the wall painting, is almost certainly and entirely fictional and based on a number of late 14th and early 15th century images, which included an apron, for which very little evidence actually survived at St Albans. A new solution which takes as its starting point the iconography of displaying an attribute in the left hand while holding a book in the right appears more plausible, especially as the surviving feet suggest a frontal position is more accurate. The use of a digitized projection will, it is hoped, allow for a modification to take place to the current projected image. Coming back to St Alban Amphibolus, there are problems with this one too. The problems posed by these figures were less in the area of outline of the figures, which was reasonably secure, but in how the center of the painting could be interpreted and the fold structure of the right-hand side figure. One particular fold held the key to this problem. Once this fold was better understood, it was possible to imagine the rest of the conjectural parts of the painting, which had been completely destroyed more easily. And I'm talking about this fold here. We couldn't work out what that meant. There it is. And then it dawned on me what it was, because it's related, of course, this whole area going all the way down here. And when you reverse that, you realize that it's this clump held under the arm that then goes down. And once you realize that, you can then formulate your drawing around that, and you can see where the fold then makes sense, and it suddenly brought the figure together. That was a very satisfying moment in a very confusing process, I have to say. The fold in question is a gathering of cloth which is difficult to understand. The function of the small fold under the arm can only be understood with a knowledge of the conventions of late 13th and early 14th century depictions of biblical and other figures. A good example of this is shown in the figure of the Virgin from an early 14th century Book of Hours, which I've just shown you. If the iconographical interpretation of the scene that was followed is correct, then St Alban should be the figure on the right, perhaps also following the convention of placing the more important figure nearest the altar. However, it doesn't, because it's not correct. We don't explain which figure is which, but I've got this very strong feeling that Alban is on the left, just as in the Matthew Paris, and we've got the outline slightly wrong. I'll explain that now. The figure on the right-hand side does not display any surviving head covering, although this probably existed. Most surviving formal images of Alban show him with his head as covered, unless he is depicted during his martyrdom. It was decided, however, not to supply the head covering on the right, because there was no surviving evidence for it. But this has led to the figure looking as if he has a smaller head than would be expected in the reconstruction. And the figure on the left-hand side of the painting carries a scrip or satchel together with a travelling hat and cloak, which you would normally say are the attributes of Amphibolus, because he's the travelling priest, as it were. But of course, they're exchanging these things so that Alban can escape in disguise. And I think it would be highly unlikely that Alban would be depicted bareheaded, without a beard, and no hat. So I think Alban is actually on the left, and he's already got the scrip from Amphibolus. And in the middle, there should be the cross. This is the attire of Amphibolus, who is also depicted as a pilgrim by Matthew Paris. The scene must depict the two depict the handing over by St Amphibolus of his eponymous cloak to St Alban, which was noted earlier, but depicted by Matthew Paris in this way. A round area of modern infill was identified as the first site for the annular cross. Let's see if I can find that. Just here, if you can see that. Not sure if you can see that very well, whether I've got a better picture of it. There it is. The importance of the cross posed a problem when the digital reconstruction was attempted, as no trace of it seems to have survived on the painting itself. As already noted, this seems to be because a large figure whose head would have been on a level with those of St Christopher, St Cyther and Thomas Becket was painted over this scene, but has been removed during the 19th century scraping down of the wall in an effort to clean the whitewash surface away. It is probable that the overpainted figure was defaced, but the iconoclasts had no idea there were images of Alban Amphibolus beneath the larger image. This would account for the fact the face is still visible, but it also probably accounts for the fact that the central area has disappeared because it had been overpainted with something else that needed to be removed. The center of the painting has disappeared entirely where the cloak would have been in the original painting, but this may be a coincidence rather than deliberate targeting of this area. So that is what we eventually came up with, the final image on the right. I'm now going to show you how that works. The first illumination of the painting was made to a public audience on the 17th of September 2019 to the Cathedral Plus conference hosted at St Albans. The programme event suggested that delegates will be able to benefit from what boasts to be the nation's densest concentration of traditional pubs. But it also has these wonderful paintings, I should say. It could be argued that earlier in the year, the British Museum had used a similar technique to project the Ashkenazipal painting, bas-reliefs that I mentioned earlier. But these pose no problems of reimagining fold structures and dress, only the addition of colour based on minuscule samples taken from the surface of the paintings. The benefit of scientific information about the colours originally used to paint the bas-reliefs gave the British Museum exhibition the opportunity to reassess the impact and significance of the narrative, in the same way that the Abraham and Eliezer tapestry had been illuminated at Hampton Court. In the case of St Albans paintings, no reliable investigation of what colours were actually used has been made so far, and the colours used in the project for the project are entirely fictive. Basically, we did them to add contrast and made the paintings legible. They've also been chosen so that the proximity to the piers in the nave can be taken into account. So we need to go down. I'm showing you this rather shaky version because the shaky version shows you how we've tried to match the colours that are still on the walls with some of the colours that we actually project, so that when you actually project them, I'm sorry, my hand is shaky when I'm doing this. When you see it in situ and it comes to life like this, you begin to see why it was done. Whereas when I showed you the plain projection itself without the context of the wall on which it's depicted, it makes less sense. I felt that would be an interesting way of seeing that. Run it again. Similarly, if we take this one, I do apologize for my shaky hand. The St. Christopher, you can see on other parts of the cathedral painting those colours that have been matched. Sorry, it does shake. My hand was. It's only taken on a mobile phone. And what this actually shows is a change of light actually in the cathedral while it's being projected. And you can actually stop the images and project the plain outline, the individual colours, or the unified colours, depending on what you want to do. Sorry. What's that one? See, when you don't have the context, it doesn't actually come to life in the same way. I'm finishing on that because I could show them all in those. But the best thing to do is to go to St Albans. And if you do go to St Albans, before I finish, in the next few weeks, you'll also be able to see the Chronicles Exhibition at the museum, which contains both Matthew Paris's work, the famous Matthew Paris elephant, Walsingham's work, all sorts of chronicles from St Albans, Psalters, and various other manuscripts which haven't been brought together before, I believe, in that way, in a really, really splendid small exhibition. So you can get the benefit of both. And James Clark put that exhibition on University of Exeter. It's absolutely brilliant exhibition. I do recommend both. There we are. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, Michael's very happy to answer. Michael's very happy to answer questions if anybody has questions. So,
you will need to wait for the microphone so that it can be heard in the wide world beyond.
Well, a couple of aspects of those paintings interested me, and you probably explained this in your book. With the St Thomas,
yep,
seems to have an architectural background or sort of canopy, does it? Or is that just me being?
It does have a canopy.
Yeah, but it seemed like little buildings in there. Maybe I have wishful thinking. It was a very early image that you had, and I wondered if it were London, but surely you've spotted this and thought about it. No, I've got it wrong. It's no surprise that these...
This one here?
Yeah, it's no surprise that these things should have been repainted under the AS, is what I was looking at. It's no surprise that these things should have been repainted, I suppose. After all, they did wear out with time. And
yes, what I should have mentioned more clearly, I think it was in the label, is that the St William, which looks like a perfectly good painting, is in fact adjusted in the 15th century. So if you look at the St William there, the cross is actually added. We used to have a crook, and the armorial below has been added, and the label St William has been added. Most of the rest of it is okay as 13th century, but in fact it's both 13th and 15th, and the analysis of the colours suggests that some of the green is actually 15th.
Odd iconography here at St Albans.
There was a reason why St William became popular there during the 15th century to do with the Wars of the Roses, but I don't think I really want to go into that.
No, okay. So let's give the people time to think up questions.
Lindy Grant.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating paper. Can I ask about St Zita? I was surprised that we're not allowed to talk about rosaries early, and I wondered if you could explain a bit more about that, and also a bit more about St Zita and why she seems suddenly when she appears in Britain and
Yes.
more about background
well,
to
one
her.
could give
Thank you.
a whole lecture on St. Zita. St. Zita is almost unique in English iconography in being a female saint from a region of Lucca in the 13th century, who had a cult in England, but not in Italy. So the family in actually, she was a maid servant and had these visions and ideas which went against that of her master, which is quite interesting, actually. She would give bread to the poor, rather like St. Francis would give his cloak to the poor. She would be a bit absent-minded and give alms to people or be late for things, and always there would be an intervention, and suddenly the bread that she'd given to the poor would miraculously be presented on the table because the master would be really unhappy. And the relationship with this very, very authoritarian master of the house and this maid who was trying to help the poor is an interesting one. She then gets involved in England, becoming someone you pray to if you've lost your keys. And not St. Anthony's a later sort of thing. It's her. And the idea of St. Zita seems to have been really important in medieval England. In Lucca, she was regarded as some form of holy, and they still have the body, but she wasn't made a saint until much, much later on. I think perhaps 17th or 18th century she was made into a saint, although they have the body of St. Zita in Lucca. So basically, this is an English phenomenon. The text seems to have arrived at Bury St. Edmunds, and from Bury St. Edmunds it was disseminated out and seems to have become more and more popular. As you can see from the text I showed you, it was actually translated into Middle English as well. The person who's written most about this that I know is Caroline Barron, who's championed St. Zita for a while now and gave a very interesting paper at a Hawkston conference recently. But basically, it is a very fascinating story. And the fact that there was an altar, St. Zita, at St. Albans is very important because it attracted these little gifts from housewives and women. And this was a money spinner for St. Albans, there's no doubt about it. And that's why she's up there, I think. It's very distinctive. That rosary, catching that rose is very distinctive. It is her. And there are, not thousands, I'm exaggerating when I say thousands, obviously. There are many, many images of her in stained glass, wall painting, and sculpture all over England. Some people thought that perhaps she was associated with London because of Lucchese in London, but I don't think that's the case. I think, in fact, she was popular all over England for all of these reasons. And that relationship with the master is a really interesting one, actually, because he's very severe and nasty to her, and there's something underlying in that relationship with his being expressed by this cult. But then, of course, the family in Lucca, then once she became a holy, as it were, promoted her. So they took advantage of her as a maid and then took advantage of her as a saint, if you see what I mean. But it didn't go very far until much, much later in history. So a very fascinating subject is St. Zita. And she's 27th of April, I think, is her I've been told recently.
Okay, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. Sarah Brown.
Thank you. Michael, I wondered if you could say a little bit about public reception of this project. You mentioned the guides being somewhat disappointed, but presumably lots of other people have been rather excited by all of this.
Well, no, I should say that people have been completely amazed by it, and it's very gratifying. And in a sense, the lie in the title is this isn't very digital and it's not very archaeological. I mean, it is digital in a sense that they're appreciating it, but the point of the whole thing is to make the experience of seeing these saints come to life part of your visit to St Albans, and everybody who has seen this, I haven't seen anyone who's not been completely amazed by it. They're amazed by it because I think the way that Craig thought it out. Craig, and this is Craig wanting, as an archaeological artist, he thought it out. He said, you've got to have layers, and you've got to project those layers individually. You can't just project one image up there and say, this is it. What you've got to do is you've got to show the process, show it come to life, and as you colour it, people say, I understand. And they also, I think, understand the mistakes, because I tell them all. I tell them about the mistakes. And there are mistakes in this. And it's so wonderful that there are mistakes. In my view, it's a good thing that there are mistakes, because you can now revise it, and you are not damaging the original thing. And as people come together, other people may come together and say, I know what should be in that hand because I found another image. You can find all sorts of ways of working this out with further knowledge, as it were. So it's been amazingly successful. The chapter are delighted. The visitors are amazed. I don't know of anyone who's been to look at it that hasn't been amazed by this emergence. That's why I wanted to show you the shaky ones, because the way they emerge is so remarkable when you're actually in the building. It somehow brings the wall to life in a way that you couldn't imagine just by looking around. I think when we used to go to places like Rome and buy those flip books that showed you the Colosseum complete, it's almost a bit like that was the early printed version, and now this is the digital version of that idea of bringing ancient Rome to life. We're bringing back these medieval saints.
I have a couple of questions from the digital floor and a comment from Rasheen Astel. Fantastic talk, first of all. Under the painting of St Alban, meaning below the painting of St Alban, and St Amphibolus, there is a small head floating. Yep. Do we know the function of this figure, and is he at your eye line if you stand underneath? And as a follow-on question, is there evidence for other decorative programs or further decorative programs beyond the initial images?
That little floating head is very, very interesting indeed. It doesn't have a cross nimbus. However, is that because the cross nimbus has disappeared? Was it scraped off? I don't think it's been scraped off. So the fact that it doesn't have a cross nimbus poses a problem, because if it were a cross nimbus, then perhaps we could say it's some sort of vertical figure, but it could be a vertical figure without a cross nimbus. So it's not related to the inscription above. The inscription above records a family who gave money for the restoration of paintings. So we know there was probably another painting below the big painting above, which had been, so we've got Alban Amphibolus, someone's painted something on top of that, then underneath someone's actually painted another one, and then below that the head, which may be a vertical head, might not be a vertical head. It's about, I think it's about there as you're looking at it. And I've wondered about it. It looks to me like an early 14th century head, but I may be wrong. It's very difficult to work that out. But the inscription doesn't relate to the head doesn't relate to the Amphibolus. So you've got 3 or 4 layers of painting there.
And that base below the Alban and Amphibolus looks like it's made to receive 2 kneeling figures.
It's quite possible. It's possible. But the thing is that the arches that you see were scraped into arches. And what I saw in raking light, occasionally I had a vision of angels, but maybe I was wrong.
Was there another question from the digital floor, Richard? You said you had...
That was 2 questions. 2 questions from Rasheen.
Okay. Further questions, please.
No, I'm happy not to have any more. Sorry.
There is wine, Professor.
There's wine and there's books. We're launching 2 books this evening, so I hope that people will stay around for that. Michael, Do you happen to know offhand when the exhibition of the Chronicles closes at St Albans?
I think it will be probably the end of this month.
Oh, golly.
So I think it's
Me like
quite
that.
soon, actually.
Yeah.
I thought it was on until next year, but I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I've forgotten, sorry.
That's
We
fine.
can be looked up. It can be looked up.
Yeah, that's fine. End of October, yeah, so end of this month. Okay, thank you. All right, well, if there are no more questions, I'll ask you to join me in thanking Michael again, and then we can assemble outside. Thank you.